Like every other election year that I can remember, 2020 was filled with people calling for unity and civility in the political sphere. These calls always seem pretty vapid to me, but especially in a year when the state failed the people over and over, I found myself wondering what mindset would allow people to continue to believe that unity or civility for their own sake are actionable or meaningfully possible in today's environment. That question leads me to what I want to discuss in this video: Death Stranding. What makes Death Stranding worthy of examination in this discussion is that it not only seemed to predict many of the events of 2020, but it's also willing to offer advice on how the present political situation in the US could be addressed. But it's profoundly bad advice. It's not just a coincidence that the game's director, designer, writer, producer, auteur, Hideo Kojima selected the United States as the backdrop for his game about reconnecting people and societies.
When I was designing Death Stranding in the concept stage, in the real world America or Europe, I saw signs of divide in the world. Even though we are all connected via internet, there was a lot of thinking of individualism starting at that time. In Death Stranding, it was almost like an alarm I wanted to put out into the society of what's going on.
What I want to really dig into in this video is what alarm Death Stranding actually sends out to the people of the United States and the world, and how the idea of reconnecting is deployed in relation to government specifically. Because beyond the simple message of reconnect, Death Stranding seems intent to say quite a lot about modern society, modern governments, and modern people. But most of all, it has a lot to say about the government of the United States of America, and why that government is a necessity for the continuation of human civilization and is the ultimate mediator of all subordinate connections. If you're not familiar, the setting of Death Stranding is a post-apocalyptic United States that has been torn apart by a series of interconnected natural, supernatural, political, and sociological issues. A fair amount has been written in this last year about how the world events portrayed in Death Stranding have found parallels in the events of the year 2020. Delivery people risking life and limb to bring packages to those safely hiding in their bunker homes. Social isolation due to the risks associated with human contact. Domestic terrorist accelerationists operating freely in the countrysides and empty city streets. And the disintegration of trust in the government leading to separatism and toxic individualism. But whereas in reality, each of these issues can be directly tied back to failures of the American government to address said issues, Death Stranding portrays the causes of these issues in a way that avoids that uncomfortable reality. As we'll see, Kojima's attempts to mediate the relationship between the American people and their government in this fiction is rarely convincing, and when taken as a message intended for Americans today, it is unmistakable as a product of neoliberal propaganda. In Death Stranding, America cannot fail its citizens. It can only be failed by them. To make what I just said start to make sense, let's first examine the list of situations that Death Stranding seemingly predicted. The situations themselves have obvious parallels, but if we look beyond the phenomena to their actual causes, we see that rather than just adapting the real-world causes of these situations into his fiction as well, Kojima has taken creative liberties that have the effect of shifting responsibility for these undesirable conditions onto the individuals most affected by them. So to start, let's look at the deliverers. In reality, these are often gig workers or other similarly precariously employed persons who deliver out of a need to survive in a capitalist economy. The availability of these persons to provide their labor so that others need not risk themselves by going out is exclusively due to the precarity that all of us suffer from within capitalism. And the American government, with its integral connection to capital, has provided an embarrassingly small amount of support towards any solution amidst the pandemic. But in Death Stranding, this is not the case. The porters, as they're called, are not gig workers as such. While they are explicitly shown to be contractors...
How about it? Can we count on you? Then Bridges hereby enters into a contract with Sam Porter.
The experience of playing as one only superficially resembles gig work. Although the game does seem intent on evoking some aspects of the gig economy with star-based rating systems for success, in-depth performance monitoring, and the need for porters to maintain all of their own equipment, and even their own roads, it sidesteps the problems we see today by portraying these folks as doing this job entirely voluntarily, and without the desperate hustle that defines gig work in real life. Death Stranding's America is, after all, post-scarcity. Die Hardman clearly states that scarcity is not an issue anymore, only logistics. This means that the porters are risking their lives not out of desperation, but out of a desire to help their fellow humans. They are also rewarded with positive feelings from helping other people due to the fictional natural hormone lycocin that happens to be triggered to release in those situations, which is as close as they get to payment for their services. While they do have to maintain their equipment via resources, these resources are generally plentiful, and they aren't really critical to their direct survival. Death Stranding reframes the modern convenience of home delivery as a willing gift given by generous individuals, instead of its reality as capitalist enslavement of the poor. I think this reframing becomes even clearer when we discuss the mules.
Shame we gotta deal with their bullshit at all. Back in the day, AI did everything. Deliveries were handled by unmanned vehicles and drones. All we had to do was sit back and let them work. It was revolutionary, damn near singularity. No reason for it not to take off, but it didn't. People didn't like it when we took the human element out of the service industry. So, after some consideration, we put it back in. Made jobs no one really needed and gave them to folks who couldn't live without them. And from there, it snowballed. Now we got cults of cargo-chasing crazies who get off on hijacking shipments.
The mules are the cargo-chasing crazies that Die Hardman refers to here. Former porters that became addicted to delivering and then were left in the wilds on their own because they were no longer useful. In a parallel of the modern capitalists' vicious attempts to ensure gig workers are provided no worker protections or adequate considerations for pay or maintenance, we find the mules tossed away by the rebooted American government known as the UCA and its corporate contractors. Death Stranding portrays these guys as ostensibly voluntarily living out in the wilds attacking passerbys, ignoring that their addiction to deliveries is caused by a hormonal imbalance linked to the lycocin I mentioned earlier. Despite that explanation, they are portrayed as ultimately at fault for their own behavior, that they more or less willingly became addicted to doing deliveries, and that caused them to lose their minds.
Humanity needed to be a part of the process, so laws were put in place, and we stepped back into the picture again. And then what happened? All the people put out of work by machines, who got called up again, convinced themselves society couldn't survive without them. And that brought on a whole new disorder. Delivery dependence syndrome, they called it. Eventually, delivering goods became all some lived for. They were obsessed, addicted, consumed by the desire to deliver.
If we think about modern concerns about AI taking jobs in the real world, it's typically not that people are afraid that they won't have work for work's sake, but because work is required for survival under capitalism. Work is also the only means by which the vast majority of people have any say in the direction of their lives. Kojima, and many other speculative fiction writers of the last couple decades, have somehow come to the conclusion that once machines take all the jobs, the governments of the world will just suddenly provide enough for everyone, free of charge, in a new post-scarcity world order. But when has the American government ever behaved this way? In reality, skepticism of the replacement of human labor is entirely warranted, because most of the benefits of free trade and automation have been reaped by the already massively wealthy ruling class, while the workers are left behind to fend for themselves. Death Stranding's reconfiguration of this real-world concern, combined with the reframing of the porter situation, shows a complete misunderstanding of why people work under capitalism in the first place. This creates a situation where the desire of the people to work hard to survive is transmuted into a selfish desire to feel useful. The concern of the people who would block the full automation of Death Stranding's America are lifted from real-world concerns, but placed into a context where they're rendered absurd and even sinister. This allows these people to be portrayed as either crazy or selfish or both, and absolves Death Stranding's America of fault for the situation of the mules and the porters. The preppers are the next group that I want to discuss. Unlike the mules, they're not afflicted by some sickness of the mind that prevents them from seeing reason. And yet, the actual reasons that the preppers have chosen to separate themselves from America are portrayed as just as nonsensical.
We once had a network spanning the whole wide world that could send items from anywhere to anywhere and connect anyone with anything. But still we were isolated, still we were alone. Some liked it that way and even wanted more. They wanted walls along their border, wanted to turn away refugees and outsiders. Some even wanted new nations all their own. They began to see the state as an enemy of their freedom, not a protector of it. The ones most far gone, they didn't trust the country to defend them if something went really wrong. War, terrorism, natural disaster, you name it. So they built shelters and stocked full of supplies in preparation for the worst.
The phrase that I want to point out here is most far gone, implying a disconnect from reality. Reality is then described as the fact that the government would always be a protector of freedom, a protector from war, from terrorism, from natural disasters. Next we have this line from Hartman, where he describes where society went wrong amidst the Death Stranding.
Somewhere along the line, we lost sight of tomorrow. We reduced ourselves to animals, focused only on the here and now.
Taken together, we can understand Death Stranding's critique of Americans' distrust in their government as being due to short-sightedness and selfishness. The extremely valid real-world concerns of Americans that their government is not willing or able to protect them are projected in Death Stranding onto these irrationally jaded loners, who have no substantive reasons within the fiction to distrust their government. Throughout the story of Death Stranding, these far-gone preppers are then slowly brought into the fold one by one as the player completes missions for them, and they each, in turn, admit the mistake in their thinking that led them to disconnect from America.
It's an exchange, joining up. We sacrifice a little privacy, share a little expertise, and you agree to look out for us. Not a huge price to pay, but it's enough to help the cause. A tax, if we're being honest. We pay, we get protection. Contracts alone won't cut it. We're just free riders that way. Not giving up enough, not getting enough. And if you dodge your taxes, you can't be surprised when there's nobody around to look out for you. Quid pro quo and all that.
The simple arrangement described here is the basic theory of the social contract between a nation and its people, but so frequently in reality, especially in 2020, we have seen this contract broken again and again, not by the people, but by the American government. But in Death Stranding's America, this contract was never actually violated by the government. Sure, they were unable to protect everyone from the Death Stranding, but that was a natural disaster the likes of which no one could have predicted or prevented at the time. So to blame them for that doesn't make much sense. So then these separatists are not actual revolutionaries intent on the destruction of the American government for real ideological reasons, but are instead just petty squabblers who abandon the government out of unfounded mistrust when it needed them most. Now, of course, in reality, we have many reasons to distrust and dislike the American government, and I'm not going to spend my time laying all those out. But this scenario again follows the previous theme of removing necessary context from the situation in order to portray those who, in reality, are the victims of government malfeasance as instead fully responsible for their own situation and the harm it has caused them. When considered alongside the message of needing to reconnect, all of these messages by the game position the American government as needing to do absolutely nothing to repair the relationship, instead putting the onus on those individuals who have made bad decisions for themselves and strained that relationship. These last two examples, the mules and the preppers, can both be blamed for their respective disconnection from America based upon their individual bad decisions within the game's world. But there is one last dissident group in Death Stranding who are disconnected because of more than just a couple bad decisions. The Homo Demons, a group of domestic terrorist accelerationists led by former delivery tycoon Higgs Monahan. At the very outset of the game, they are first portrayed as ruthless, but ultimately just seeking autonomy from the UCA, in a similar way to the other separatists we just discussed. But it's soon revealed that they are actually a literal death cult, intent upon causing the extinction of the entire human race. The Homo Demons are yet another caricature of a real-world phenomenon divorced from its context that serves to absolve the American government of its culpability. Death Stranding, of course, doesn't get into the consistent failure of the American government to take the threat of domestic, white terrorism as seriously as they should. But more than that, Death Stranding has the Homo Demons serve as the perfect foil to the American government, and leads us to another example where the tactics of American propaganda are in effect. The ongoing existence of America in Death Stranding is justified in large part by its position in relation to Extinction, and via the Homo Demons, its position in relation to a group with absolutely unacceptable ideals. America is defined multiple times throughout the game as the only viable alternative to the absolute extinction of humanity. Early in the game, this is explained as being due to the need for people to connect to work together and survive, and no viable alternative to America is presented. Later, once the goals of the Homo Demons and Higgs are clearly defined, America, as represented through the player character Sam Porter Bridges, is the only opposition to their plans. While the previous examples I described just literally remove the causal link between America and those situations, this positioning of America as the only thing standing between humanity and extinction helps to delegitimize alternatives to the American government. Therefore, the separatists and preppers are portrayed as somewhere between selfish idiots or actively evil for not signing on to the UCA already when the stakes are so high. Throughout Death Stranding, there are these moments where characters will ask things like, is all this rebuilding America really worth it? And on a very surface level, they will discuss that question, but the resolution of the question basically always boils down to, well, it's either this or extinction, with no alternative between those two extremes considered. This same framing is frequently deployed within real American politics today as well. Whatever the center-right mainstream of American politics and media have selected as their current scapegoat for all of America's problems becomes framed in these same absolute terms. Obviously, this simplistic way of portraying America is not something unique to Death Stranding. Orienting the situation in this way is very common throughout pro-America media and other pieces of media that don't want to get into the complications of a nuanced representation of global politics. But especially when you're trying to send a message to the American people and the world about their relationship to their governments, this kind of laziness is inexcusable. That being said, it can still be used to make an effective point if some other pieces are executed well. I think a good example of this is Stephen King's 1978 book, The Stand. The Stand centers on a group of survivors in the US after an outbreak of a 99.4% fatal superflu, which has demolished the population of the country and left the survivors to create a new society. Like Death Stranding, these survivors must make their way west as they attempt to rebuild America. In opposition to these survivors is a society of other survivors, led by a charismatic sorcerer named Randall Flagg, who attempts to gain control of nuclear weapons to complete the process of the extinction of humanity. The division of the remnants of humanity as either joining the pro-democracy, pro-rebuilding America team of good guys, or Flagg's despotic death cult, negates questions about the necessity of rebuilding America. It helps to invalidate the idea of starting something new based on new principles, and instead focuses the energy of the characters into a narrow set of possibilities for the future. In exactly the same way, and in a similar setting, Death Stranding deploys this same narrative strategy to achieve the same overall effect. America is not just the best option, but the only option. But while these two stories share many similarities in setting, theme, and plot, there's a key point of departure that I think helps to make The Stand more effective. That is on the question of why America deserves to be recreated. As we just discussed, in Death Stranding this question comes down to a choice between America and annihilation, because America will ostensibly serve as a medium for human reconnection and therefore prevent an impending supernatural extinction event. Also, because America will deliver all the cool stuff to the people that join. By comparison, the characters in The Stand come to the conclusion that the good parts of America that should be recreated can be summarized as democracy. They recommit America to democratic values via elections of a ruling council who then take responsibility for caring for their people. Beyond simply positioning America as the only alternative to extinction, this conveys an actual ideological core that underpins why, in that story, America is worthy of continuation. This is then reinforced by the willingness of the characters on the ruling council to sacrifice their own lives, taking responsibility as elected officials to actually face their problems head-on and at extreme personal risk by going off to fight Randall Flagg personally. The Stand also benefits from the fact that all the previous elected officials of the United States government died of the superflu, meaning that the new government can on some level be freed from past mistakes. In Death Stranding, we can see literally the opposite. Democracy has seemingly been abandoned following the collapse of America, with President Bridget's successor being decided by a process identical to succession along family lines. Then later, after the presumptive presidential successor, Samantha America Strand, is revealed to be a world-killing non-human entity, the former president's right-hand man, Ty Hardman, is appointed president without mention of an election process. Die Hardman and Bridget never really risk themselves personally on a dangerous quest to save the world, instead sending out reluctant contractor Sam as their proxy to risk his life. Rather than committing to a specific promise of improvement to material and political conditions in order to recreate human connection, like in The Stand, Death Stranding remains fixated on a vague psychosocial idea of reconnection. This idea runs into yet another problem in its application to America when we discuss America's leaders, Die Hardman and Bridget Strand. In the cases of these two, and pretty much nowhere else, Death Stranding is willing to admit some fault on the part of the American government. Die Hardman and Bridget were both involved in the secret operation started by the former president of the US to create the Bridge Babies, or BBs. During this involvement, Bridget Strand ordered Die Hardman to kill a man, Cliff, who was attempting to rescue his child from this program that would have turned his baby into nothing more than a tool to avoid the ghostly entities that the Death Stranding had caused to flood the world. Following their few-month-long term as tools, the Bridge Babies are then incinerated, because they're no longer useful. The program itself is treated as somewhat problematic, but overall justified because of the usefulness it produces. And really the only thing that Bridget and Die Hardman are ever really held accountable for is the murder of Cliff. And by held accountable for, what I mean is not that. Bridget dies very early on in the story, but her death is kept secret until much later so as to not panic the American people. Her legacy is maintained because the BB project is kept mostly secret, and only very few people are made aware of her order to kill Cliff. The man who actually pulled the trigger, Die Hardman, of course, becomes president and is never held accountable by anyone, really. The man he killed, appearing as a kind of war ghost, decides not to exact any kind of revenge, which Die Hardman then interprets as,
I guess when he saw I was trying to do my part for America, he remembered who he was.
So he let him live. Becoming president narratively serves as Die Hardman's penance for the murder of Cliff. Both Die Hardman and Bridget Strand finish the story without their pasts revealed to the public. Where The Stand avoided this problem by killing off the entire government, Death Stranding stumbles into the problem of the complicity of American elected officials in terrible crimes, and then uses those crimes as justification for those people to remain in power to pay back their debt to society. As a message to the audience, here is what I see this conveying. Your government, in the best interest of the people, may do awful things. You must forgive them this, and trust that they will apologize to the right people. Ultimately, their position of power is a heavy burden that they have accepted as martyrs in defense of some ultimate good. The installation of Die Hardman as president at the end of the game, because there doesn't seem to have been an election, thus represents a continuity of the status quo of America. It will not actually come to terms with its crimes or its failings, and will continue to keep them secret so as to not endanger the continuity of American power. But what does this decision mean for the American people, who will continue to be ruled by this seemingly unelected regime of killers? What does it mean for Sam and Deadman, who now have knowledge of what their government did, and must keep that secret so as to not risk a dissolution of this country that only just regained some sense of stability? We can find our answer by looking back to the positioning of America as the only answer to extinction, which enforces compliance with the false narrative amongst those who are closest to the country's leaders. With all these messages laid out, we can now put the pieces together and see what message Death Stranding has in relation to the American government, and what warning Kojima wanted to express to the world. First, we are to conclude that personal responsibility is the key factor behind the disconnection of the people. That they are choosing to disconnect because they are greedy about their labor, or they are unfoundedly paranoid about government overreach. These selfish and irrational concerns are extra unreasonable because of the danger facing the country, which is only bolstered by the people's refusal to fall in line behind their leaders. And speaking of leaders, if we find ourselves in possession of knowledge of their misdeeds, we must find it in ourselves to forgive and forget so as to not risk damage to national stability. Individually, these messages are stupid, unhelpful, and unproductive. But taken all together, they form a pattern of thinking that I find alarming because of the world that it advocates for and the people it says should have power. Part of this comes down to who these messages would resonate most with. The overall message of connection is fairly universal, but these specific messages about how we should think about and interact with our government are much less so. For anyone with a precarious housing or job situation, for anyone with medical debt or without real insurance, for anyone struggling with student loans, to say, don't try to make your government do something about that, that's a you problem, is not helpful. Then, if these same struggling folks say, well, if the government won't help, then who needs it? Let's get rid of it. They're a threat to stability and need to be handled. The message to these folks is, you must participate in this society and this economy, but you can expect absolutely nothing from it, and questioning that arrangement can get you into trouble. For people that understand that the American government, no matter who runs it, will always be a force for imperialism abroad and capitalist exploitation at home, it's very questionable that we'd want to pick that as our lesser evil, instead of just abandoning the system that always forces the selection of lesser evils. The result of Death Stranding's separation of real-world effects from their causes is that the messages in this game don't make sense as a well-reasoned socio-political analysis taking material conditions into account, but they make perfect sense as the distillation of the priorities of the comfortable liberal. For comfortable liberals in the US, the problems facing the country today can be reduced to just one person, Donald Trump. To them, the disunity of the American people, the disconnection, comes down to the foolishness of those that would follow this odious and embarrassing buffoon.
President Trump right now is building a wall. Then you have Brexit, where the UK is trying to leave the EU, and it feels like there are lots of walls and people thinking only about themselves in the world.
The cause of the disconnection between people and their rulers that Kojima seems to abhor is not the real and incessant exploitation and suppression of the people, but the loud and boisterous language of nativist nationalism that he cannot so easily tune out. Unlike the now silently accepted mechanisms of subjugation that governments have used for centuries, Trump is loud and grating. But while his defeat means he will no longer embarrass the country through his bizarre behavior and by saying the quiet part loud, the core issues of this country that caused him to come to power and that put him in a position to conduct the most extreme evils of his regime will remain utterly unchanged. This is not an accident, because the things that really need to change in this country, like wealth disparity, structural racism, and out-of-control policing, aren't things that the rich and powerful liberals in this country have any sustained interest in changing, because that would mean upsetting their position in society. This is how someone who has said that nothing will fundamentally change can have a slogan like, "Build Back Better." These ideas sound contradictory, but from the perspective of neoliberalism in America, these ideas are in fact complementary. The position that no fundamental change is actually a good thing only makes sense if you already believe the same things that Death Stranding is attempting to convince its audience of. That people need to step up and fix their own lives, and not count on any real increase in government support. That people need to fall in line behind their government, or risk further turbulence in American public life. That people need to forget about Biden and Harris's past issues and allow them to bring the country back together. We are being asked to accept no fundamental change. Consequently, the party that offers to build back better is able to promise no real material benefit to its base, just a promise to return to a more aesthetically pleasing fascism. One that is not loud and boisterous and embarrassing, but is instead calm, condescending, and predictable. We should find this desire for a return to calm amidst rampant injustice equally as offensive as a desire for a return to a mythical golden age of American exceptionalism. Both materially entail the maintenance of imperialism and the expansion of authoritarian methods of control. So when we see people talking about things like reconnecting people and unity, it's important to consider the perspective from which they say these things. Because as I've described, there are at least two very different ways to think about these ideas. One, which acknowledges realities, and therefore demands real change, and another, which avoids realities via the application of liberal propagandist tactics. Death Stranding's idea of unity, like that of comfortable liberals, depends upon ignorance of the proximate causes of disunity, and an acceptance of a unity that calls upon everyone to embrace the status quo. Death Stranding is right that people do need to reconnect, but we don't need to forget about our values to do this. In fact, any reconnection that does demand the abandonment of people's real material concerns is one that is doomed to eventually fail again, in the same ways and for the same reasons as the first time. In addition to the certainty of its eventual failure, the healing and reconciliation that is suggested here is not what I want, and I hope that it's also not what most of you watching this want. We don't need the well-off and powerful in this country to be able to not pay attention to the news anymore, to go get brunch and forget about everyone else's problems, to start talking to their racist rich family members again because they can both get behind the outdated neoliberalism of Joe Biden. The reconnection they are offering is no reconnection at all for the poor and powerless, only obedience and silence. The reconnection that America needs, that the world needs, is one based not in liberal unity, but in solidarity.